Okay, well, today is the 14th session in our series in Evangelism and Apologetics. Raise your hand if you don't have a handout from the last Sunday. From the last Sunday? Okay. Because last Sunday's handout will be our handout for today as well. And as I said last time, next Sunday will be concluding my teaching in this series with a consideration of Islam. We're going to apply the presuppositional apologetic method to the religion known as Islam. And then the following two Sundays, which will be the last two Sundays of the series, I think, will be a debate that we'll hear between Gordon Stein and Greg Bonson. It's known as the Great Debate from the 80s. And I think that'll be really helpful for all of us. Any questions from last time? Any thoughts? I do have a bit of follow-up from a question that Larry asked last time. Okay. All right, if no one else has anything. Larry had asked about the statement that I had made regarding the authenticity of the New Testament, the textual tradition that we have behind it, and extra-biblical evidence that what we have is what Jesus said, is what the apostles wrote, that it hasn't been corrupted from the time of the first century and afterwards. And I had said that there are enough quotations in the early church fathers, or just the church fathers, to reconstruct the entire New Testament. And he had asked, where is that in scholarly literature? And so I just did a brief search yesterday on the web, and I found a quotation. The best source, I think, is from Bruce Metzger's The Text of the New Testament. And if you've studied the languages at all, especially Greek, Bruce Metzger, which, didn't he die a couple years ago?
Seems like I did hear that.
Okay. He was a former Princeton professor and the authority in the area of the Greek New Testament, probably just Greek in general.
Actually, he's got a great little book, where he goes through every textual variant.
That's right.
It's very helpful. I don't understand a lot of it, but somebody does.
Yeah, he's written great resources, not just for seminarians and pastors, but they're for all Christians. And again, that book is called The Text of the New Testament by Bruce Metzger. And on page 86, he wrote, "If all other sources for our knowledge of the text of the New Testament were destroyed, the patristic quotations would be sufficient alone for the reconstruction of practically the entire New Testament." Now, that doesn't mean that it would be an easy thing to read the first 500 years of Christian history and do that, because as I read from one other person, it's difficult to sort out. Sometimes the quotations aren't verbatim, like when Larry preaches. It's not always to the T. That's fine, but nonetheless, if you were to spend 20 years of your life and read all of the church fathers, you'd be able to do that. Another person who said a similar statement was Paul Barnett, whom I'm not familiar with. Paul Barnett. He said, the scriptures gave rise to an immense output of early Christian literature which quoted them at length and, in effect, preserved them. And then Ron Rhodes, who's written some very helpful books in how to deal with Mormonism and Jehovah's Witness cults, he said, quote, "As noted at the beginning of this chapter, in addition to the many thousands of New Testament manuscripts, there are over 86,000 quotations of the New Testament in the early church fathers. There are also New Testament quotations in thousands of early church lectionaries or worship books." So Ron Rhodes is another scholar who's made a similar statement. And if you want you can, all of us here are fairly wealthy, you can readily purchase the Ante-Nicene Fathers, the Fathers that precede 325, and the Post-Nicene Fathers. You can, we're very blessed in our world today. You can buy all of that and quit your job and live off the government and just read things like that. And the resource that I commended to you last time by F.F. Bruce, The New Testament Documents, Are They Reliable? Read this during seminary. It's a very good book for the New Testament. But I also said there are great works on the Old Testament and its textual tradition. This one by Walt Kaiser. You might want to write this down. The Old Testament Documents. Are they reliable and relevant? So similar title to F.F. Bruce. I haven't read all this, but Walt Kaiser, as you guys know, is a conservative evangelical scholar and a blessing to the church. So today we're going to then continue in the subject of comparing worldviews. Last time I said that we're going to complete a checklist for arguing with unbelievers and then follow that with a brief synopsis of two broad steps in comparing opposing worldviews. And the last part, the comparing opposing worldviews, our worldview and whatever the opponent may be, will combine much of the checklist that we're now going through. And we left off, just by way of review, the first point in the four-part checklist for arguing with unbelievers, I said, was to look for prejudicial conjecture in your outline under number 1. The second was to point out unargued philosophical bias from which your opponent is arguing. And you should have that completed in your outline. Point out unargued philosophical bias. Bias is your outline blank. We talked about how the bias of the unbeliever will lead him to conclude, for example, that Christianity can't be true because he claims to know that miracles are not possible. So he has a philosophical orientation that out of the gate says Christianity must be false because Christianity includes miracles and permits them even to occur today, in my opinion. And therefore it can't be true. And we discussed how, due to the corrigibility of observation and the limitations of man, that his claim to know that miracles are impossible cannot be proved, can't be made good, that claim. And I think we finished up around that point in our outline. Okay. I don't know if I did get to this where I said that the Christian's basis for believing miracles is not, usually anyway, that we have witnessed a miracle, but that someone who knows everything has told us that they do occur and have occurred. So thankfully, we're in touch with one who knows everything. And yes.
It's really motivated me to read a lot of these things. The word exhaustive seems to help me. I know you've used it. Anybody that claims to know something has to have exhaustive knowledge of every detail.
That's right. You've often been told probably you can't prove a universal negative. Well, you can if you have exhaustive knowledge. You can't even prove a universal positive if you don't have universal knowledge. And we're going to talk about something that Nietzsche said here in just a moment that will touch on what you just said. So point 3 in the checklist for arguing with unbelievers is to show the dialectical tensions or incongruous presuppositions within the philosophy of the unbeliever. And so that's the sophisticated technical way of putting this third point, to show the dialectical tensions or incongruous presuppositions within the philosophy of the unbeliever. All of you, if you've engaged unbelievers in an attempt to share the gospel, have probably done this. We naturally oppose, we as humans, inconsistency and incoherence. Whenever we see it in our own lives, when we're hypocrites, it troubles us, doesn't it? And it even troubles, by the grace of God, at least usually, the unbeliever. He's bothered if you point out that he has beliefs that just don't go together in his thinking. So What does incongruous mean in that statement? Incongruous presuppositions, not harmonious, inconsistent with itself. So incongruous presuppositions, the foundation of a person's worldview, they don't go together. So unbelievers, I like to boil things down to really down to earth ways of putting it. Unbelievers have shirts in their underwear drawers. So they have things in their worldview that ought not be there. And so presuppositionalists, we answer fools according to their folly by pointing out their incoherence. An example of this was in 2006. I opened a fortune cookie. I love Chinese food. If you don't know that about me, you can eat it every day, every meal. In 2006, so I went to a restaurant and there was a fortune cookie message, and the message read this. I have it stuck in one of my outlines somewhere. I taped it in there, and the message says this: "Luck helps those who help themselves." Were we together?
I can't remember what it was, but yeah.
Okay. And when I first read that, given who I am, I went, there's something wrong about that. I didn't immediately come up with what I'm about to share, but I went, luck helps those who help themselves. So I started thinking about John MacArthur's lecture on luck one time, and then, of course, the help those who help themselves is, not biblical. What's that? Yeah, it's not in the Bible. Anybody have any thoughts on what's wrong with that statement?
No such thing as luck.
Okay, you said, Patricia,
Pride would be involved
pride would be involved?
because you would do it yourself.
Oh, okay, and we know God opposes the proud, and
Right.
and then Larry, you said there's no such thing as luck. Okay, so it'd be like saying Santa Claus helps those who help themselves. Yes, Andrew.
Aristotle defines chance as something happening, and everything's caused, but it's something that happens without final cause, without somebody intending it.
Uh huh.
So I think luck would fall into that category. Something that happens, something that's going on that's not intended
Uh huh.
or planned. So, but the other half of that statement is that you should plan that. So it's a contradiction.
Yeah, right. So, like as you're saying, if it's not planned, it's not purposeful, it's gratuitous. So, how's that going to help you? Yes, Michael.
Luck is not a force that can cause things to happen. It's usually a word we use to describe the result of when something happens. You were lucky.
Uh huh.
But luck doesn't have any moving parts. It's not a force that can cause anything.
Right. And I think if you talk to most unbelievers for 30 seconds about luck, they'll admit, yeah, it's just a term we throw out there because we don't want to say it was providential because we hate God. So we just say we were lucky. Ben, will you get me a glass of water thank you.
Some of us have this spiritual.
Yeah, right. So I had written in my notes here to summarize, luck pertains to a chance happening, a random event or thing, and being without purpose, it then cannot help anything, even those who help themselves. And so that fortune, as I was sitting there, I critiqued it on its own terms and found it to be wanting. It really it was unintelligible. Here's another example, because a lot of times, as I've said before, we learn by illustration and examples more so than just throwing out statements. Appreciate that, sir. I mentioned before that in 2004 I attended a debate with Austin Dacey and William Lane Craig at Purdue. Everybody remember me mentioning that? Okay. And earlier I mentioned it because I then was critiquing Craig. And I didn't ask the question to Craig that would have been a critique to his apologetic argumentation that he employed that evening, because I thought it would have been inappropriate in that setting. And so instead I asked Dr. Dacey a question during the Q&A time, and I said this, and I had written this out so I didn't mess it up in front of 2,000 people and confuse him. I said, in your case for atheism tonight, you spoke about the blind causal mechanism. That was his expression, the blind causal mechanism that drives macroevolution. You reject the notion of an immaterial dimension in man, for example, a soul or a mind. And you have spoken about things being good, evil, moral, and immoral. Assuming your worldview does provide a basis for morality, which of course it doesn't, still, how can people be held accountable for their actions if their actions are the result of that which natural law, as opposed to one's soul or mind, dictates? In other words, why punish a murderer if he is just an advanced weed? And the crowd erupted. Yeah, mostly with laughter. And I don't think all of those laughing were Christians, because a bunch of college students produced a fairly good school, and they recognized that I had not just exposed a part of his slip, I had pulled his whole skirt up over his head. And that's not because I'm brilliant. This observation's been made before, that if you're a materialist, and that's certainly what Dr. Dacey was advocating in his defense of atheism, then all of jurisprudence fails. We should have no lawyers, Lucas. It's just a big crapshoot out there. We don't punish oak trees for producing acorns. We don't punish some weeds for producing things that are toxic, which kill people, because that's just what they do, right? So why do we punish people if they rape someone and murder them, if we're just weeds, if we're just advanced animals? And he just, I thought, did a pathetic job in trying to answer that. And then Dr. Craig got to respond and say, yeah, this is what, it's an insightful answer. It's what's been pointed out before. And there's no response from a person like Dr. Dacey on this. And so as you grow in Christ and become more thoughtful, more critical in this life, this will become natural, where you'll hear people say things you may not immediately be able to recognize and put your thumb on what is the problem here. It may just be something unsettling. And we've all had that experience where someone says something and we think, well, there's just something not quite right about that. But on a moment's reflection, you can come back and say, this is the problem. Sometimes it may require them, Michael, we've talked about this, how you give the unbeliever enough rope to hang himself. It may require him to talk a little more. Get him to, it's like a cop interrogating the criminal. You want to get them to talk enough where you see, you said this over here, but then you're saying this now. These don't go together. And sometimes they don't notice that, right? We oftentimes don't notice our own inconsistencies. We have to have a brother come along and say, you're sinning in this area. And so we want to be good teachers, Andrew, and point those things out, help them. A lot of notes we're going to skip here. You can tell, Tim's not here.
I was just thinking about how the Miranda rights and the Freudian psychology that came into our judicial system pretty much saying that it's not the fault of the criminal because he's just a creature of an environment, that it's no longer the criminal's fault for what they did. It's the environment that he grew up in. And so it became where they started coddling criminals and treating criminals like they're sick. It's not their fault. They're just a creature of their environment.
Sure, very good. Yeah.
You can see how much that's helped us in our judicial system in law and punishment.
Well, Lucas, how much of this did you run into during law school? Did this come up, the discussion of culpability and...
A bit, especially in criminal law, but then also a jurisprudence, a class in jurisprudence that I took. Overall, not a lot.
Okay.
They tend not to get that deep in the theory of it unless you take classes in it. But
Okay.
a little bit.
Some, okay. All right, moving on, the fourth point. And there's a lot more we could say about each of these, but for time's sake, the fourth point, and this is the ultimate level, in my opinion. This is the rock bottom of apologetics, where we want to get to, theoretically speaking, with the unbeliever. And that is, you want to point out the failure of the unbeliever's worldview to provide the preconditions for the intelligibility of human experience. Do you have an outline, Vern? Okay. You can have another one and copy.
I had one.
So you want to point out the failure of the unbeliever's worldview to provide the preconditions for the intelligibility of human experience. In other words, show the pagan that his most basic assumptions or presuppositions about the world, how men can know what they claim to know, and how we are to behave in this world, results in the inability to know anything at all. So in your outline, the second blank is inability. And this is a restatement of things that I've said before, I believe. So the question here is, will you be able to show your unbelieving neighbor that his worldview fails to provide the preconditions for the intelligibility of human experience if you don't know anything about his worldview? Anybody?
Say that again.
So the question is, will you be able to show your unbelieving neighbor that his worldview provides or doesn't provide for the preconditions for the intelligibility of human experience if you know nothing of his worldview? No. Right. So that's why next week we're going to spend an entire hour, which is really very, it's not enough time, on Islam. Fastest growing religion in the world, according to a lot of so-called experts. Over 1 billion people profess to be Muslims, and yet most Christians have no idea what Islam teaches. So, just like a good doctor, I've said before, I'll say it again. In order to help our patients, most of all, we need to know the cure, right, to their problem. So you got to know this right here very well, the Bible. But it's also very helpful to know his condition, to know that whatever he's believing, let's say he is a Muslim, to know enough about that sickness to be able to show the patient, this is a real problematic, this is the problems with your illness. Yes, Susan.
A lot of times when we go out door to door witnessing, we run across someone who would claim a certain religion, certain belief, but then when you start talking to them, you realize that they don't believe everything that the institution would. For example, the Catholic doesn't necessarily believe everything that Catholicism teaches. One of the things that I remember learning was to listen to them, not just to refute their thoughts or their ideas, but to know exactly where they stand so that you're not misrepresenting them.
Sure. Yeah, or if you concluded something that wasn't characteristic of their belief system, then you began to hammer at that. When 10 minutes later they say, well, I don't really believe that. Well, that was a big waste of time. So it's good to listen to them. Yes.
Schaefer says that, when he first meets someone, he spends about 80% of his time just listening. Because like you said, he needs to get a good profile of who this person is. Not necessarily like Susan just said, the institutional position of their faith, but this individual that's in front of you.
Right.
And it takes discipline on a person who wants to just, give your spiel as far as what you believe is the truth, which is the truth, but a lot of times the people that they see you listen to them, you hear out their position, they're a lot more willing to listen to you afterwards.
Yeah, that's true. Right, you've earned their respect and favor. And also, if you're like me, if you've studied, say, Roman Catholicism for 3 or 4 weeks and really put a lot of time into it, you wish that your professing Roman Catholic were a real Roman Catholic so you could just start hammering away at what you know from your study. But then you find out, well, this person's a Roman Catholic heretic, and now I got this big mess here I got to deal with. Yes.
One conversation I had with my coworker, I asked her, well, who do you say Jesus is? And she said, well, the church teaches that Jesus, and I stopped her. I said, no. Who do you say Jesus is?
Uh-huh.
And she said, well, I've been taught that Jesus Christ, and then I stopped her.
Uh-huh.
I said, no, forget about what the church teaches. Who do you believe Jesus Christ is? And she said, I don't know.
Hmm.
And I had an opportunity to share the true Christ with her. She had been a professing Mormon most of her life.
Everybody hear that?
Yeah.
That's good. Yeah, make it personal. So for your outline, all forms of unbelief, our claim is, on which we can make good, lead to absurdity and skepticism. Absurdity and skepticism are the two blanks there. Now, the transcendental argument for the existence of God, a term we've used before, has therefore been thought of, in light of what I just said, as a reductio ad absurdum form of argumentation. Is that on your handout? Reductio ad absurdum? Good. So I don't have to spell that. So the Latin, Andrew, reduced to absurdity, I believe. Yes, sir? Okay. So if we say that all forms of unbelief lead to absurdity, understandably, people will look at the transcendental argument as a form of a reductio ad absurdum. And so we, as Christians, are showing Christianity is shown to be true due to the impossibility of a contrary worldview being true. So all worldviews that are contrary to Christ or Christianity may be reduced to absurdity, reductio ad absurdum. And then do I give the formal definition of what that is on there? Reductio ad absurdum? Okay, from the Dictionary of Philosophy. Good. So what can make sense out of morals, science, human dignity, logic, human freedom, language, love, your like of Chinese food, anything you want to put in there? What can make sense out of anything at all? The claim is only the Christian worldview, because the fear of Yahweh is the beginning of knowledge. The fear of Yahweh is the beginning of wisdom. And a right understanding have all who do his commandments, the psalmist says. So I want to point out, though, that the reductio itself, that argument, is not the transcendental argument for God's existence. They're not one and the same. Rather, the reductio is an illustration, or we might be more precise and say the reductio, in however it's stated, is an illustration of the necessity of Yahweh's existence and his word, the necessity of Yahweh's existence and his word, that the Christian worldview is true and should be believed by all persons, while the non-Christian worldview is false and ought to be rejected. Is that in your outline? Yes. Good. So the reductio is an illustration of the transcendental argument. As I've said before, there is no transcendental argument. You go look up in the dictionary. Now there's a definition of what a transcendental argument is, but how that is fleshed out, how the content of that argument is going to vary. Aristotle had a transcendental argument for God's existence. Muslims have transcendental arguments for God's existence. Now realize, and I think I've said this before, you don't always need to get to level 4 whenever you're reasoning with your unbelieving neighbor in order to faithfully defend the faith. You're not going to come out of the gate normally and say your worldview lacks the preconditions for the intelligibility of human experience and then go on and on. No, many times, as I said in the point 1, that it'll be sufficient when reasoning with your unbelieving neighbor if you just point out that his beliefs about Christianity are arbitrary. They're just opinions that lack a foundation. And we talked about having manuscript evidence, or there not being evidence for the Hittite civilization, and therefore Christianity is false, he says. We discussed those last time. But in principle, what your apologetics should come down to is level 4, in principle. Why? Well, when all is said and done, when you and your unbelieving friend, say, have spent 20 hours talking about life, and you've stated that you interpret experience and evidence differently in accordance to your respective religions, you'll be forced to consider each other's faith commitments, your grid of basic commitments, presuppositions, and what you claim to be indubitable. So if we don't get beyond a mere consideration of things out here in no man's land in the neutral territory, which really doesn't exist, if we don't get beyond looking at bits and pieces of belief systems and instead compare the whole worldview with each other, We're always going to run into this impasse. If you don't press pagans to examine their most basic assumptions, their first principles for building their house of knowledge, a stalemate's going to occur. And you'll be forced to conclude with Ludwig Wittgenstein that those who disagree with each other can only resort to calling each other heretics. Really, that's what happens. If you don't, in principle, if you don't have as a resource, as a recourse, if you've exhausted levels 1 through 3 and they're still not seeing things, they're refusing to repent and admit that they are intellectually bankrupt, to go to level 4. So, having said that, we're going to move to the last part of the series. So all this work is really going to get boiled down to this right here. The 2 steps to comparing opposing worldviews of each person's presuppositions. So 2 steps to comparing opposing worldviews of which each person's presuppositions are made. Step 1 is to perform an internal critique of the unbeliever's thinking by walking the unbeliever through the 4 points we just stated. So arbitrariness, unargued philosophical bias, dialectic tensions, and unable to provide the preconditions for the intelligibility of human experience. I just memorized those at one point in my life, so that when I'm reasoning with someone, I think, where am I at? What am I doing? Just to remind me, he's probably throwing out some arbitrary claims here. Is that true, Tony? And if so, point them out. So ask what makes sense out of or makes intelligible the debate between you and your neighbor. The debate between you and your neighbor. Ask the unbeliever what must be true in order for us to make sense out of rational dialogue itself. I keep mentioning it, but something Nietzsche said here in a moment we're going to talk about. A philosophically adequate worldview must simultaneously, this is so important, must simultaneously account for, integrate, and explain at least the following facets of human experience. We're going to look at 14 characteristics of human experience. The simultaneity of these suppositions or presuppositions, because they are foundational, is very important. Why is that? And let me just say here, I don't think this is the best method of teaching, just going through here and asking questions and giving the own answer. But for time's sake, that's what we're going to do. It'd be great if I could say why and then talk about that for 30 minutes. But why is it important that we stress or keep in our own minds the simultaneity of all of these facets of human experience? Because we don't believe as Christians in what Van Til and others have said, a blockhouse method of defending the faith. We're wanting to get beyond what I said a moment ago, just analyzing and evaluating bits of human experience. Instead, we compare entire worldviews, not simply questions about and the acceptability of parts of a worldview like God, logic, science, human personality, dignity, laws, freedom, etc. The Christian worldview is accepted on authority, and that's the authority of Christ, who does not permit anyone, including us, to tinker with his worldview. That's for your outline, worldview. Christ doesn't permit that. It's all or nothing. You submit to the entire thing or not. You don't have the option like the liberals want to do and treat the Bible like a smorgasbord. Yes, Vernon.
I just think about compartmentalizing. There was an issue dealing with Hitler's his governmental system, fascism, and so forth. And there's a lot of people out there, economists, trying to separate the effect of what he put into place governmentally from the system. And a lot of people are saying you can't do that. You can't try to separate what happens if you put this system in place. It all comes together, just like you're saying. You can't try to say, oh well, yeah, we cut off people's head because of some of the overall worldview, but we don't want to focus on that. Let's just focus on the good part that we think is acceptable. And you find that with a lot of people, like you said, with atheists and so forth, they want to only focus in on the areas that look good to them. They don't want to look at the overall consequences of their worldview or their world plan.
Yeah, and if you've studied the history of philosophy at all, there's a reason that there's a rise in what you call analytic philosophy over against looking at life in a more comprehensive fashion. And that's because skepticism has not been refuted. Thinking people have recognized that the quest for a comprehensive worldview that explains everything and can knit it all together is doomed. And therefore you have the rise of psychology, psychiatry, sociology, individual sciences, which are really idolatrously focused on just one aspect of human experience. And that's what Doyeverd himself said, that we as fallen people, we've rejected Christ, we lack a worldview that makes sense out of all of life, and so we become idolatrous and we worship math, or we worship sociology, or we worship science. So the Christian apologist does not seek to establish the God of the Bible. No, he or she begins his defense of the faith with the presentation of the entire worldview, assuming the God of the Bible. Every element or facet of a worldview that we're about to look at is argued for within a worldview, because there is no such thing as a brute fact. Even laws of logic, which is the focus of the debate between Stein and Bahnsen, the laws of logic. So why are there no brute facts? Because everyone interprets every aspect of being in accordance with a worldview. There's no neutral zone. You're probably saying you're repeating yourself too much, but this just can't be overstressed. Neutrality is a farce. Okay, so a non-Christian worldview may be able to, we want to admit at the outset of a debate, account for one precondition for the intelligibility of human experience. One of the 14 we're going to look at. Big deal. Big deal. The challenge is, can the unbelieving worldview, in whatever form it takes, simultaneously account for all of the facets of a human experience we're about to consider? Simultaneously. And no, they cannot. And upon analysis, this is admitted by the Nietzsches and the Kierkegaards and the Rousseaus of the world. That's why you have a rise in, if you look at the progression of philosophy, you go from empirical, rationalistic to romantic era. And then, I don't know where y'all are at in the Schaeffer series. Well, I'll save that for a moment. But you move, there's just this progression towards an abandonment of wanting a worldview that simultaneously accounts for all these things. So if there be rationality and knowledge of anything in the world, one's religion or worldview must account for at least the following items. 1, the laws of logic, and, you might want to circle "and" there, the laws of logic and the requirement to follow them. That is, to be rational, to be reasonable. Logic alone is woefully insufficient to justify a worldview. Let's say you do have a lot of laws of logic that work for you. But how then does that abstract, non-material, particular entity, how does that, not particular, universal entity, how does that get into your head? This is something I sometimes think about. How does my material brain relate to a universal, abstract principle such as a law of logic? Furthermore, for your outline, if I don't have it, why must I follow the laws of logic? Well, we as Christians think we must, because to do otherwise would be sinful. And there's not just tons of laws of logic. Let's just take a basic one like the law of non-contradiction. We don't believe we have the right to contradict ourselves. That's immoral. 2, scientific inference and the uniformity of nature. We're going to need to just go through these and probably come back. Scientific inference and the uniformity of nature. That's something we've harped on throughout this series. The worldview must be able to account for, number 3, abstract concepts and general principles. 4, ethical prescriptions or moral absolutes, not just descriptions of a society's moral code, but are there prescriptions? 5th, the general reliability of the senses. Think of David Hume here. If we believe that our senses have failed us once, why do we then think they're generally reliable at all? Number 6, the worldview should be able to account for man having mental freedom to consider evidence and make decisions. Remember my challenge to Austin Dacey. If we're just advanced weeds, why do we punish criminals, or so-called criminals? Why do we punish the weeds that happen to look like us? 7, free will. I don't mean free will in the way it's often used theologically. The worldview should be able to account for us having free will, the ability to control our bodies. That's related to number 6. 8, human dignity. 9, uniqueness and individuality. And there's a lot that we could unpack under each of these. Number 10, the origin of life. A real thorn in the side of Darwinian evolutionists. Number 11, the particularity and diversity that we encounter in our experience. Larry mentioned last Sunday the problem of the one and the many with which philosophers have wrestled for a long time. Christians, of course, don't have to wrestle with that because we have a resolution to that in the ontological trinity, as Larry pointed out. Number 12, objectivity in language. Finally, I get to share my Nietzsche quote. So Friedrich Nietzsche, the 19th century atheist philosopher, he wrote in his work, Twilight of the Idols. You can write down that title. Anybody read that? Twilight of the Idols? I haven't. He said, I am afraid we are not rid of God because we still have faith in grammar. Have any of you heard that quote before? That's brilliant. And I praise God that Nietzsche said that. That is worth a lot for you. Is that in your outline?
Yes.
Yeah.
Doesn't that fall in the category of the logos, the word?
Yes, if you're saying that the logos is God who gives objectivity to human experience. And that's what we're at here. That's why it's
Number 12, you had 2 words, objective what?
number 12 is objectivity in language. If there is no God, how can there be laws of grammar that govern communication? Grammar is a lot like math. There are rules that describe reality. But if we're all just subjects, if there is no omniscient, all-controlling being, then there's just sound and fury signifying nothing. There's just things in motion. And if there are rules of grammar, why aren't they just conventional? In the Schaeffer series, are y'all at the point where he talks about the play that was done, where the actors got on the stage and just sputtered out gibberish?
Must be this, we're in number 9.
Okay, it's in the latter couple or 3 of the 12 or 10 parts.
Who was the guy that's making gibberish out in the middle of the street trying to...
That's him.
Yeah.
Music, yeah, he just is, then he leaves he sits down at the piano and makes funny noises and then gets up and people clap.
Right. That right there is exactly what I'm talking about here. And when I was going through my notes, that came to mind. I actually watched that after first doing my notes a few years ago. But people are just being consistent. If there is no objectivity in language, let's all just go, and what are we doing right now? Why are we doing this? And so praise God for Nietzsche, who, by the way, if you don't know, was brilliant. Well, okay, we got to move on. Number 13, limitations in our abilities. So we fall short. Limitations in our abilities. Remember when I was telling you about my conversation with Steve McKenzie after my little trip across the Sea of Galilee, and he said, why do smart people disagree with each other? And my answer was, because people are sinners. And that's not always the case why we disagree with each other. But when we're evaluating the same evidence and both people are normal, however you define that, and they're looking at it and they come to different conclusions, why is that? Well, we have limitations in our abilities, and it's not just the ability to look at something, physically speaking, but it's that we have hearts, as W.T. Jones says in his philosophy book when he's reflecting on the history of philosophy, and Nietzsche admitted this, there's something wrong with man. You know, we've gone 2,000 years and we're not making headway. What is wrong with man? Why is it that if we're all so rational in this world, and that we can just look and see to learn truth, that men disagree to the point of war? Why do entire schools of philosophy teach its pupils to deceive each other to win arguments? The sophists, sophistry, modern day politicians. Seriously. Fourth, recovery from failures. And this is where we get to make more explicit the beauty of Christ. How may man recover from his failures? This is where Christians must stress the redemptive nature of our worldview. The gospel is at the heart of evangelism and apologetics. I mean, the whole, hopefully you've recognized that the whole Bible, I'm saying, is necessary to do apologetics. This is the foundation for even having the ability to account for talking to the person. So we have to bring this in at the outset of the argument. But it's the heart of apologetics, because we want to be able to provide and account for the failure of man, but not just that he's a sinner, but there's a way to resolve the problem. How do people stop warring with each other? How do you get schools of philosophy to stop warring with each other? They become Christians. How do you get societies? How do you get the government to stop stealing from its people? They have to have a change of heart. The answer is not welfare programs. The answer is the preaching of the gospel. But I qualify this, and not qualify, but add to it, supplement, the preaching of the gospel can't be a reductionistic 4 laws of Jesus. Amen. That's why we're at the point we're at in church history, in my humble opinion. We have boiled Christianity and the gospel down to nothing. So it's really not Christianity at all. So God redeems all of us, and he explains how, though redeemed, we still sin. And so as you discuss these preconditions that we quickly ran through, constantly ask, how do you know what you claim to know? So, Michael, a tactic that I know you've used is, how do you know X? That's for your outline. How do you know X? What's the basis for your believing X? Now, hopefully, you've noticed that a thorough knowledge of the Bible is necessary to do apologetics. It's the authoritative source for how we are to defend God. How? Not just what God is, but how we are to defend him. And in order to defend the veracity of Christianity, or the truthfulness of Christianity, you must be able to explain what the Christian worldview is and how it provides the preconditions for the intelligibility of human experience. So if you're outline what and the how. And here's a couple examples, and we'll finish next time with the last step in comparing opposing worldviews. But the 2 examples, you may have been wondering as we went through those 14 preconditions. Well, Tony, can you account for self-identity over time? Can you account for moral prescriptions? Can you account for whatever? Here's an example. Where do Christians derive their basis for scientific inference and the uniformity of nature? And I've given the answer to this before, but turn to Psalm 104:14. Psalm 104, 14. And do I give this to you, these verses? Okay. So please write these down. In my Bible, for the past 4 years or so, 5 years or so, I've actually been writing in my Bible PC. Well, it's Angie's Bible now, but if you looked at my Bible, there'd oftentimes be PC in the margin. It's precondition. Psalm 104:14. He causes the grass to grow for the cattle, and vegetation for the labor of man, so that he may bring forth food from the earth. Verse 20, same chapter. You appoint darkness, and it becomes night, in which all the beasts of the forest prowl about. Pretty philosophically sophisticated, isn't it? That's a joke. Psalm 147, write this down. Psalm 147, near the end of the book of Psalms. 15, verse 15, God sends forth his command to the earth. His word runs very swiftly. He gives snow like wool. He scatters the frost like ashes. Continuing on, this is actually verses 15 through 18. He casts forth his ice as fragments. Who can stand before his cold? He sends forth his word and melts them. He causes his wind to blow and the waters to flow. And a verse that I've mentioned before, paraphrases Genesis 8:22. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. So isn't this beautiful? We have a basis for induction, or the uniformity of nature. This isn't all of it. It's just a smattering of verses that you can appeal to. Say, I have it. An exhaustive, or a person who knows all things has told me these things. That while the earth remains, day and night shall not cease. That's my basis for believing that tomorrow the properties of steel, 4140 ASI steel, is going to be what it was 2 days ago. It's a wonderful thing. Yes, Vernon.
It's just my song for this morning was 65. It says in verse 8, it says, they also who dwell in the farthest parts are afraid of your signs. You make the outgoings of the morning and the evening to rejoice. You visit the earth and water it. You greatly enrich it. The rivers of God is full of water. And I was just thinking about what you were saying about, at first I didn't understand when it said you make the outgoings of the morning and the evenings rejoice. But the nature is not nature separate from God. The angels and all the illustrations in the Bible, it talks about the angels moving and doing all these things. It talks about also the waters of the waves and the waves and so forth. God controls every wind that we feel, everything is under God's direct sovereign control at every moment. And it's just something to think about. You know, we tend to be humanistic and saying, oh, nature, and we think of a mechanistic system that God wound up, and yes, God is here, but the system is working on its own power. No, it's God.
Right. It's good.
Yeah, it's a refutation of deistic.
Right.
Exactly.
Where God winds things up and steps back.
Yeah.
So when we look at a beautiful sunset, we say there's another dismissal of God's
Yes.
day.
Yeah. Self-identity over time is something I've thrown out there a few times. Where do Christians derive their basis for self-identity over time? You can write down Luke 2:15 through 21. Luke 2:15 through 21. Here you have the story about the angels. Let me just read part of this. When the angels had gone away from them into heaven, the shepherds began saying to one another, let us go straight to Bethlehem then and see this thing that has happened, which the Lord has made known to us. So they came in a hurry. They found Mary and Joseph. They saw the child. And you can read the rest of that. With that, Luke 23:33 through 34. So please write down Luke 23:33 through 34. Here we have Luke recording the words of Jesus. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. And they cast lots, dividing up his garments among themselves. And then 35, you can read. I read 34. Yeah, so just 34 is fine there. So you may be wondering, how does this have any relevance to self-identity over time? Well, Luke's story of Jesus' life and ministry, it presupposes the fact that something about ourselves, the essence of man, endures over time in spite of the changes that take place. Okay, that's all I mean by self-identity over time. When I look at my baby picture, I am that person. There's something that has endured over time in my life that I am who I was in that picture. The same with Jesus. If the notion of self-identity over time, that we can continue to be who we are even though I just lost a few skin flakes, there they go. Brain cells probably just fried. I'm still who I am. I'm still Tony. So the Bible presupposes that fact. Now, nowhere in the Bible do you find God saying, you, on my authority, must believe in the notion of self-identity over time. No. Just like the deity of Jesus is illustrated, it's just taken for granted. Oftentimes the greatest verses for the deity of Christ aren't explicit, I am God, John 1:1 kind of texts. Instead, they're just things in passing. The Bible assumes that the concept of self-identity over time, because if it didn't, then this Jesus here, 33 years later, is not the same Jesus that Luke talked about in Luke 2. Why is this important? Well, if the identity of the criminals, in this case, we even have criminals in Luke 23:32, could not be maintained over time, then Luke could not have called the men at this point in history criminals. Once created, the existence and identity of self continues forever, according to the Bible. Remember the 6th century philosopher Heraclitus? He said you can't step in the same river twice. If all of reality, however, is in flux, if things do not possess some unchanging identity throughout time, then Lucas' jurisprudence, myself right now, the act of speaking, affection towards Angie or any of you, and other human practices become nonsensical. So the notion of self-identity is not just important for considering yourself, but it's important and necessary, that which must be true, if we're to make sense out of language, law, punishing criminals. Is any of this making sense? Okay. These are the things we want to harp on. Say, how does your worldview account for that? Why do you have a basis for believing that you're now what you were back then? Because you're very different. I mean, you know, Randy, when you look at pictures of yourself when you were 20, you probably look a little bit differently. Not quite as good looking back then, but you know. But Randy still says that's me in that picture. What basis does he have for believing that? If he's just a bag of cells, you know, he's different. All of us see he's different, but he's not totally different. If he were totally different and he killed someone back then, should we punish him today? No, because he's different. It's not Randy. Yes, Andrew.
I'm wondering if you could argue the same conclusion based on God's eternal, unchanging nature. That's a clear concept in Scripture.
Sure.
And then we're in His image, so you would expect entities created within various dimensions of change to persist through that change if they were in His image, and if they were in the image of a changeless, changeless and something changeless being.
Sure.
Is it important to make arguments like that, or is it more important to look at specific places in Scripture where it's presupposed?
I think it's very important if your argument can be clearly supportive of Scripture. And that'll be important with the unbeliever because he's an unbeliever. He doesn't know the Bible like you do. But if you can just open up and say, here's a verse upon which I found my belief in self-identity over time, or a few verses like the story of Jesus, he can see that. He can read that and see it. And the idea of our being made in the image of God, or our being the image of God, it's not simple. There's a lot to it. There's a whole book Anthony Hoekema wrote. It's very good on that. But I think that what you just brought up is